Koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui, he mihi mahana kia koutou. Welcome and thanks for coming along. My name is Dr. Ben Payne and I work for East Coast Life at the Boundary. Tonight is our third virtual science talk. So far in this series, we've had two great presentations on the science being done to better understand the Hikurangi subduction zone and the risk it poses to us living here on the East Coast. Last Thursday night, we heard from Dr. Caroline Holden and Dr. William Power from GNS Science, as well as Natasha Blunden, who is the project leader of the Hikurangi Response Planning project. They provided some great insight into the science that's going on, the science behind the scenarios, which have been developed to understand how an event on the Hikurangi subduction zone could unfold and how it might impact on our communities. If you missed this talk, it's now up on our East Coast Lab YouTube channel for you to watch. Caroline, William, and Natasha join us again this evening. Welcome along, guys. They are joined by my colleague and our good friend, Dr. Julia Becker. Julia is a social scientist based at the Joint Centre for Disaster Research at Massey University in Wellington. A big warm welcome to you, Julia. Tonight's conversation expands on last week's talk. William and Caroline will begin by highlighting what the scenarios might mean for particular parts of the East Coast region. However, a natural hazard only becomes a disaster when it impacts people adversely, and social impacts and preparedness are definitely the specialty of Julia and Natasha. Just before we get underway, we were aware that there have been some issues with scammers. So once again, please remember that this is a free event. So don't click on any links in the comments and certainly don't provide any of your personal details. Just a little bit on how this will work. The four speakers will present first. Then I'll facilitate asking the panel your questions. If you have questions during the presentation, please write them in the chat box or keep a track of them for at the end. And we'll be keeping an eye on these for question time at the end. So I'm going to move on to Caro and she's going to get the ball rolling.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, do I have control? Let me see. Awesome. Yes, I do. Thank you. So, kia koutou, everyone. My name is Caroline Holden. And last week, with my colleague William Power, we presented the recipe behind the earthquake scenario for the Hikurangi Response Plan. But that particular scenario had variable impact all throughout New Zealand. And so today we're looking at what is driving this variability of impact and what kind of impact are we looking at. So in particularly, William and I will focus on physical impact, but then my colleague Natasha Blunden and Julia Becker will look at the societal impact of that scenario. Okay, so let's get started. Right, so as a start, I thought I would just refresh your mind with the proposed scenario for the Hikurangi Response Plan. An earthquake occurred as it's a sudden movement of two sides of a fault, right? The fault that we consider here is the Hikurangi subduction zone, which separates the Pacific plates that dips under New Zealand with the Australian plate that comes over. So for the scenario, we have a really large fault plane of 500 by 150 kilometers square, and it's represented here by the color surface that you see on this figure here. So 500 by 150 kilometers square is actually, it's pretty credible because it's consistent with past Hikurangi earthquakes that have been observed from recent studies. Okay, so we have a credible scenario here. Now, I said an earthquake is a sudden movement between two sides of a fault. So we need to put some slip on this fault, and in order to have the scenario to be very disruptive, we need very large tsunami and we need large ocean floor displacement. So we put a lot of slip on this particular scenario near the ocean bottom, so near the trench of that subduction zone. So we have lots of slip here. So the color represents how much movement occurs between the two sides of the fault. We have lots of slip here near the surface, but we also have, you've noticed, lots of slip at the bottom here at the southern part on the Hikurangi subduction zone. The reason behind here is, again, to stay credible. Recent geodetic studies have actually, or GPS studies, have highlighted that the region of the two plates in this particular part of the Hikurangi subduction zones, the two plates are locked. They are accumulating a lot of strain, and they are locked here. And so we expect that in the next earthquake, we're going to have a lot of slip, a lot of fault movement in that particular area. So a lot of slips in the southern part of the zone here. Now, the rupture doesn't occur instantly. It starts somewhere and it propagates all along the fault. So we've got 500 kilometers here where the rupture can start anywhere. We've put the hypocenter, so where the rupture will start, or the hypocenter, we put it in the middle of the fault plane. Okay, so that's our scenario. And I will jump straight into the effect of the impact of this particular scenario here. In terms of effect, so we're looking at widespread, strong ground shaking. It's on this particular figure here, it's represented in terms of MMI intensity, so modified Mercalli intensity. This is a really convenient way of representing the strengths of intensity of ground shaking because it translates directly the strength of the ground shaking into impact. So it's representing the impact on the human and the built environment. So if we take the MM7, which is the yellow color here, so MM7 is very strong ground shaking. And in terms of impact, it represents damage to poorly designed structures, unreinforced masonries, chimneys, but no, we don't expect any damage to very well or to well-designed buildings, for example. So you can see that MM7, a very strong shaking, is occurring pretty much all over the North Island and the top half of the South Island. Now, if we look at the East Coast, this is a very different type of shaking strength we're expecting here for that particular scenario again. We have NMM 8 to 9, which is intense and severe ground shaking. So in this particular scenario, we expect with MM8 and MM9, not only the poorly built structures, we expect them to perform really badly, but also the well-designed structures will also experience some substantial damage. So just in terms of ground shaking, we can see that there's a variability of strength of ground shaking if we go from the west to the east coast. And that's really driven by how close the region is to the fault plane, right? The east coast is much closer to the subduction interface than the west coast. Now this only represents the shaking intensity, so how strong the ground shaking will be, but it doesn't represent how long the shaking will last. And you remember this fault here, actually I'm going to do a pattern here. This 500 kilometer long fault will take a few minutes to rupture. And so you can expect that the shaking experienced in New Zealand will be at least a few minutes again. And so to express the strength of the duration of strong shaking, with my colleague, we've plotted this picture where you can see we're illustrating the ground shaking that will be over MM7. So how long very strong ground shaking will last at some places of all locations around New Zealand. And you can see that obviously there's a discrepancy between the west coast, which is going to last less than 30 seconds, and the east coast, when you expect long shaking because of the proximity to the fault, but also there's some variability all along the east coast of the North Island and the South Island. So we focus first on the South Island. We have a large red patch, about a minute of very strong shaking for this Marlborough area, Northern Canterbury. This is due to the fact that the earthquake is propagating towards this region. It's a directivity effect. So we expect stronger shaking. And just because the fault is really big, we're going to have long and very strong shaking there. Now, there's another area of interest here, is the Gisborne East Cape region here, which has also very long and very strong severe ground shaking is expected here from this particular scenario again. And this is unrelated to the earthquake. This is the ingredients from the scenario that we cannot control, but actually driven by the geology. This region is actually close to a very deep sediment basin that tends to amplify and extends shaking duration. So again, variability from the scenario due to the proximity to the fault, but also driven by local geological condition again. Now, the other effect of the scenario here, it's an interesting one. It's actually, the earthquake is not going to shake New Zealand. It's also going to deform the landscape. We're going to have parts of New Zealand that are going to be uplifted, and some of the parts are actually literally going to sink. The sinking part, we call it technically subsidence. And so what this picture illustrates here, the red colors represents part of New Zealand that will be uplifted during and after the earthquake. So this is permanent changes to the landscape of New Zealand. And the blue region represents the region that will subside or sink following this particular scenario here. This is not unusual for New Zealand. If you remember a recent example, the Kaikoura earthquake that in 2016 uplifted part of the coast offshore Kaikoura. What's important here as well is that not only this is going to change the landscape, but also when the seafloor gets displaced, then you get all the elements here to create a tsunami. And so this leads me to the tsunami impact for that particular scenario. Here we're looking at the impact of a tsunami in terms of the water height offshore. So we haven't looked at the details of what's going on at the coast. William will talk about this later on. We're just looking at very broadly at the water height offshore. And as expected, it's following the pattern of uplift of the ocean floor that we see on the left picture here. So we have a large tsunami amplitude here in the southern Warapa Wellington region, and also widespread tsunami generation all along the east coast of the North Island. Now, in that particular scenario, though, we have very little to no impact from the tsunami in the Bay of Plenty and the western Bay of Plenty. Okay, so this is just one scenario. That's one scenario out of 1,000 that could also be credible, right? So we thought it's important to also consider other credible scenarios that might have different consequences, right? So what we can do is, while keeping this 500-kilometer long fault rupture, we can change the slip distribution on that rupture, and the magnitude will stay the same. We're still talking an 8.9 earthquake. So the top line here represents the earthquake scenario and the impacts and the effects. From that particular scenario. Now we're going to look at the impacts from the same fault length, 500 by 150 kilometers square, but now we've changed the slip distribution. So we have focused, so we still have a large patch of slip to the southern part of the subduction zone, but we also have a very large asperity or concentration of movement on the fault close to the seafloor and also offshore northern Warapa here. So now when we look at the effect of the landscape, so this is the middle slide from that particular earthquake scenario, again, you're going to get uplift of part of New Zealand and sinking of the other part of New Zealand. So the uplift is the red color and the sinking, the subsidence is the blue color. But something that's really interesting to point out here, if you look at the Hawke's Bay, in our example scenario, Hawke's Bay seems to be going mostly up, right? Whereas in that particular scenario here, which is also a critical one, the Hawke's Bay region, it would be sinking. And so that has a major impact on the, major effect on the impact of a potential tsunami for that particular region here. Now we look at the tsunami generated by movement of the seafloor from that particular scenario here, the second scenario. And as expected, you get a lot of the tsunami impact that is concentrated in the northern Warapa region, and you get less of the tsunami impact for the Wellington southern Warapa region. And again, that scenario doesn't generate any tsunami signal for the Bay of Plenty and to the west of Bay of Plenty. Okay, so that's looking at where we change the slip distribution. Where the rupture starts is also controlling the strength of the ground shaking. So on the left side here, this is our example scenario where, remember, we start the rupture in the middle of this 500-kilometer long fault. And this is the distribution of the Mercalli intensity for New Zealand for that particular scenario. Now we take the same slip distribution, same earthquake, but we're just going to have the earthquake starting to the north. So we have the rupture starting in Gisborne, and propagating towards Wellington. So you can see that in terms of in terms of shaking pattern, the pattern changes dramatically here. For the Auckland region now, we are not into a very strong shaking context here. We're like down to moderate to strong shaking for the Auckland region. But we've increased the strength of the shaking along the east coast here. Now again, if you're in Palmerston North though, you would feel this is because of the proximity to the fault plane again, the strength of shaking would also be very strong for that particular scenario. Now we're taking another scenario when we take the opposite. We start the rupture next to Wellington and we propagate the earthquake 500 kilometers long of rupture to the north near East Cape. And again, we're looking at the impact in terms of the Mercalli intensity distribution. This particular scenario seems to be the one with the least distribution of very strong shaking. So remember, very strong shaking means the well-designed building will experience very little, next to no damage, whereas poorly built structure will experience damage as well. Unreinforced masonry, chimneys will collapse. But this is, in that particular scenario here, we have a reduction of that particular impact on the built environment. And again, if you're in Palmerston North here, well, you could be in a region that suffers less strong ground shaking environment, very strong ground shaking. So again, to highlight the variability of the impact, depending on where the hypocenter starts. And that's something that we cannot predict. We don't know where the hypocenter will start. Therefore, we need to consider all possible scenarios. Okay, this is my last slide in terms of impact, and William will go into more detail. In terms of impact from ground shaking, we have we have strong ground shaking. We can expect landslides, we can expect fire following earthquakes, and we can expect liquefaction. So in the interest of time, I will just focus on liquefaction here. I just explain briefly what is liquefaction and where will it happen in this particular scenario and what are the implications. So liquefaction is really the process within where a solid becomes liquefied, right? So it's very simple, but in this particular context, it's a layer of soil, of water saturated soil that liquefies. So this is due to the ground shaking. So we have this very water saturated layer of soil, and you shake it and you have the particles or the grains of sand and silt that settle down, but the water pressure increases because the water between the grains is released and the water pressure increases. Now, there's nothing better than a cartoon to explain what I've just said. So I borrowed this cartoon from Engineering New Zealand, which really illustrates really nicely what happens during liquefaction. So the top slide represents before the earthquake, and the layer that I mentioned just before, so this really water saturated layer, is the green bluish layer that we see here. Now it's overlaid by a layer of very dry, fine sand and silt, right? So on the surface, you don't really see this really water saturated layer. And before the earthquake, you've got lots of infrastructures and lots of buildings as well. Now the earthquake shakes the ground, and as I said before, the grains settle down. So on this water saturated layer, the grains settle down and water pressure builds and gets ejected through cracks and crevices from the top layer. And so what happens is you have significant damage to the ground here. You've got water, you've got sand volcanoes, sorry. You have large crevices, you have sinking of the ground, the water gets exposed, and now your new surface is lower than the previous surface. So you can have also tilting of the ground, right? You have what we call lateral spreading. So the ground doesn't have any support now. And so as you see next to the river here, the side of the riverbank just collapse. So that can have a really serious impact on the built environment, so bridges, houses and buildings, obviously, but also because this is happening on the ground, it's got a really high impact on any buried infrastructures like pipes and networks and so on. I'm just going to go straight to the illustration. It's actually, I should have had this one first. This is from the Christchurch earthquake And I think it's a nice real-life illustration of the impact of liquefaction on the ground. On this slide, you can see the cracks on the ground. You can see the slumping of the bank down towards the river. You can see sandboards as well. And also this house is also got tilted after liquefaction. So in terms of structural impact, liquefaction is really, really important. Now, where does liquefaction occur? Well, you need two conditions. First, you need water-saturated layers. So you need to be close to the sea, so foreshore coastlines, or close to a river. So you have riverbeds or riverbanks. The second ingredient is actually the really strong ground shaping. And so this is why I put this map here, because if we look at the Wellington region, Southern Warraba, which will experience in this particular scenario strong shaping, you can expect that in regions of where the ground is water saturated, you can expect intense liquefaction. So for example, the Petone foreshore, Lyle Bay, the airport area as well. Now, if you look on the East Coast, obviously you can expect Napier to be strongly impacted by liquefaction due to the combination of being close to the shore, close to the sea, plus strong ground shaking, as well as the Gisborne area. Now, to come back to the title of this talk for the Papamoa region, moderate or very strong shaking. So we still expect some moderate liquefaction in the Mount Maunganui area and the Papamoa River region. Okay, and now we'll leave it to William, who will go into more detail into these urban regions.
Thank you, Caroline. Have I got control? Yeah, I think I do.
Yep.
You can see my mouse moving?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cool, thank you. So Caroline showed the offshore tsunami model for our scenario, but we could take that scenario and do more fine detailed modeling at the coast at some of our coastal cities to see what would happen in terms of where we might get inundation of the coast from the tsunami. And the kind of outputs we get from this map, from that model are shown on this map in this particular example. And the color scheme here is showing you the depth of water that gets onshore. Now, I want to stress that this result is specific to this particular scenario, and that's true both at the scale of which cities are affected, but even also applies down to which particular suburb. So a particular suburb that doesn't get particularly affected in this scenario, or coastal suburb, may get more strongly affected in a different one, and vice versa. So you should be careful not to read too much into the details. But in this scenario, we're seeing quite a flooding of Lyle Bay and the airport area, around Miramar, Evans Bay, the central business district, quite extensive flooding in Petone. So Petone is very flat. So once the water can get over the first set of dunes, it can travel quite a distance. And also along the Eastbourne coast. And we'll go into the consequences a little bit more in a minute, but I'll show here the equivalent map for Hawke's Bay. So in Hawke's Bay, in our model, the most strongly affected areas are around the river mouths to the south of Napier, and around the harbour area to the north side of Napier. Now, I want to mention a little bit some of these areas of blue. This is quite shallow flooding that are further inland. Now, if you recall Caroline's figure showing the amount of deformation, so the amount of subsidence, uplift or subsidence, this area that's to the west of Napier is actually dropping by around about 1.5 meters or so. So some of this flooding here is due to the fact that this land is no longer above the high tide level. So this may be fairly gentle flooding, not coming in as a really strong, fast wave, that is due to the subsidence and this area being below high tide. So that's good in that the damage from the tsunami won't be as great in these areas as it is where the tsunami comes in more directly. But could be a long-term issue here that even after the tsunami is gone, some of these areas may experience some flooding during high tides, at least until some new stop banks or other defensive barriers could be put in place. Here's our inundation model for Gisborne. So we see we're getting inundation around the port and the south side of the CBD, and quite extensive inundation around the Waipoua River mouth. But this is very flat, low-lying land around here. And Tauranga, in this scenario, there's relatively little impact from the tsunami, just a little bit of flooding in some of these marshy areas around the estuary. But we have to recall that this scenario, we have the earthquake that's down on the east coast. If we had an earthquake that was further north, extended further north, beyond the East Cape, the picture would look very different. So we have to bear that in mind. So this is some of the scientific data that we've generated for this scenario. And we've been using this to develop a scenario to think about the impacts and how we might prepare for them. But to go from the scientific data to the impacts, we base this on the opinions of people with relevant expertise, rather than on a computer model, a quantitative impact model. Some of the details were arbitrarily chosen. So, for example, we know that fire is quite likely to be a problem after a large earthquake, but the exact locations where fires were picked to occur in this exercise scenario were randomly chosen. So a real event will never be exactly like our Hikurangi Response Plan scenario, but the idea is that the process of working through how we would respond helps us to be better prepared for the next large Hikurangi earthquake, whatever the exact details of that event turn out to be. So here's a bit more information on the scenario we developed from the scientific data. We assumed that the earthquake would occur at 9 a.m. on a winter school day. So this is making things quite difficult at 9 a.m. It's a difficult time because children have just arrived at school, parents have just arrived at work. There's still quite a bit of traffic on the road. So that adds to the problems of people becoming reunited. Winter conditions, we assumed wet winter conditions. So again, this makes the problem more difficult, both in terms of how to provide shelter to people, and also means the risks of landsliding are greater when it's wet weather. We assume widespread shaking damage, including the liquefaction that Caroline talked about, and widespread landslide damage that would be particularly severe around Wellington and the East Cape. And tsunami impacts all along the East Coast, so from the East Cape through to Wellington and even down to Marlborough on the South Island. In Wellington, for this scenario, we suggest that the damage to the CBD would be comparable to the Christchurch CBD after the February 2011 earthquake. There would be severe landsliding around Wellington, and the city would be cut off for a while from road by landslides. There would be tsunami flooding of the south coast, the CBD, Eastbourne, and Petone areas. Essential services would be cut off, and one of our arbitrary choices we suggest for the scenario that fire would break out in the suburb of Newtown. For Napier and Hawke's Bay, we suggested intense shaking would cause damage to the buildings within the CBD, and there would be widespread moderate to severe liquefaction. The tsunami inundation would be strongest in the West Shore, Ahuriri, and the Clive Teawanga areas. And particularly around West Shore, Ahuriri, the tsunami damage would be made worse by debris from the port. We suggested that Hawke's Bay would be temporarily cut off by road due to slips and landslides. and that the tsunami and the effect of subsidence would put the airport out of use, and most of the essential utilities would be inoperable. Now, we do expect that after a large earthquake like this, well, there is a common problem of public health, and it's not unusual for there to be outbreaks of things like gastroenteritis. So one of our choices for this scenario, we suggested to simulate the case of there being a gastroenteritis outbreak in Hawke's Bay. For Gisborne, we suggested intense shaking would cause buildings to collapse in the CBD. The tsunami would hit the Waipoua Rivermouth region and the port on the south side of the CBD, and that the damage to the CBD would be increased by floating logs from the port. We suggest that slips would cut Gisborne off by road, but the airport would still be usable, though there may be some difficulties with communications and fuel, and many smaller East Cape communities would be cut off by slips, and there would be widespread loss of essential utilities. So here I'll pass over to Julia Becker to talk more about the social impacts.
Oops. Just go backwards there, apologies. Kia ora koutou, great to see you here all tonight to listen to the talk, and honoured to be able to share some of my experiences with you as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Canterbury earthquakes, because often what you can do is, if you are trying to work out what the impacts of a future disaster might be like, you can go back to some of the previous events and have a look to see what kind of impacts people experienced and what might be expected in a future event. Obviously, like the scenarios, the next event's not going to be exactly the same, so we've got to keep that in mind. Although William did say before, for example, impacts in Wellington might be similar to perhaps something that you experienced in the Canterbury earthquakes. So you do have to keep in mind that not all past events are going to be the same as future events. And obviously during the Canterbury earthquakes, there was no tsunami that occurred as well. So just a bit of a recap about the Canterbury earthquakes, which occurred nearly 10 years ago now. We know that there were 185 deaths from the Christchurch earthquake, which was the second of the larger earthquakes. And the deaths occurred mainly from building collapse and from pieces of building coming off and falling on people, or from people being injured by flying objects. As well as that, there were 7,000 people who were also injured, and those injuries mostly occurred from people moving around either during the shaking or after the shaking. And so we know that telling people to drop, cover and hold when the shaking actually occurs is really important to stop some of those injuries happening. We found that there was damage to about 3/4 of the housing in the Canterbury region, and approximately 9,000 houses were uninhabitable after the event. And so that created issues for people with finding accommodation, whether they had to stay with people in the region or move outside of the region to find accommodation there. You might remember from some of the, I guess, the media and the stories that were told, that early on after the earthquakes, there was a great sort of sense of social connection, and people got together and helped each other after the immediate shaking and the immediate earthquakes to try and respond to those earthquakes and recover afterwards. And you might have remember hearing stories about places like people like the Student Army, the Whāmi Army, Ngāi Tahu, really getting together and kind of helping people. And even at the neighbourhood level, people helped each other get back on their feet. But what did happen was that a little bit further down the line, when it was realised that some of those houses were not repairable, so people had to move out of those areas. And there's a large red zone in the Canterbury area where people don't live anymore. And so people lost those social connections as they had to move away and relocate to other areas. So that was definitely one of the impacts of the Canterbury earthquakes, that loss of social connection. Obviously, with such damage to the housing stock, housing availability and affordability decreased, and that was both for homeowners and for renters as well. And renters had trouble finding accommodation in the next few years after the earthquakes. And you can imagine that if you don't have a lot of resources, perhaps you don't have a lot of money coming in, some of those issues are even harder for those people who don't have a lot of resources or don't have a lot of money, in some of those marginalized groups. And so we know from research that if you're having a hard time anyway, some of those impacts of disasters on your life can be quite substantial and quite bad. One of the other issues that kind of came up was around heritage buildings, and we saw a lot of heritage buildings damaged during the Canterbury earthquakes. And so some of them have been repaired eventually or saved, but some of them have had to be demolished. And we know that the Christchurch Cathedral is still sort of sitting there waiting for something to happen to it. And that's almost 10 years after the earthquake itself. So if you're in an area where you're thinking about, what you need to do to respond for and recover from a future event, all of these things are definitely issues to consider. One of the interesting things that comes out of disasters is often around environmental issues. So in the Canterbury situation, we found that there was an increased risk of flooding because of the subsidence in the land. So the land had gone down, and so there was an increased risk of flooding both from the river and from the sea as well. And they have some significant climate change issues that they have to think about down in Christchurch now because of that. There was a decrease in air quality because of so much dust from the liquefaction and also from the demolition and construction. So some environmental issues for people and health issues for people who were living down there. And one of the things we don't really think about in a disaster is this issue of what do you do with the waste? Obviously, you're going to have things that are damaged by the earthquake and the tsunami. And so what do you do with it? When you pull things down, where do you put all the waste? Do you have to find a space for that waste? Are you going to reclaim some land to try and put your waste there? So thinking about planning for some of those issues are really important in terms of response and recovery. In terms of health and social impacts, there's been a really great survey done down in Canterbury, which sort of tracks people's recovery over time and how they're feeling about things. And we found that over time that some of the main stresses from the earthquake included initially the aftershocks. That was a really big stressor for people. And then as time went on, it was things like the loss of their facilities, so the loss of places to go, places like libraries or the central business district, stresses related to employment. And then over the long term is really some of those stresses in dealing with repairs and insurance, which is still ongoing today. So the stresses over time really change depending on the context and depending on what people are facing. So what you might experience immediately after the event can sort of change over time as your situation changes. There was an increased demand on physical and mental health services. And we found that the elderly were impacted, both through the loss of facilities and premature deaths, I suppose, as well. And we know that with the Hikurangi scenario, there are places in different parts of the East Coast where care facilities are located within some of those tsunami zones. So that definitely requires thinking about and planning for. Schools and the tertiary sector was impacted during the Canterbury earthquakes. Some schools were badly damaged, and so they had to set up new arrangements like site sharing with other schools, and two lots of students would go to the same school, some in the morning, some in the afternoon, to try and still be able to have the education. And in the tertiary sector, university enrolments decreased as well. In terms of violence, there was an initial spike in family violence, which is often quite common with disasters, but over time, crime decreased overall. And then finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the business and employment impacts. So for the Canterbury earthquake sequence, we had the first big earthquake in September 2010, followed by the very devastating Christchurch earthquake in February. And after the September earthquake, it kind of wasn't too bad. There were some businesses that had to close temporarily, about 64%, but only 1% had to permanently close. But with the second earthquake in February, there was some pretty big impacts, obviously, because a lot of the city centre had to be cordoned off, and over 600 commercial buildings demolished because they were badly damaged. And this led to about 11% of businesses permanently closing. So that's another important thing to think about in terms of, where you live on the East Coast. Where is your central business district? Are you going to have to cordon it off during an event or after an event? And how are you going to deal with that? And I know in Wellington, after the Kaikoura earthquake in 2016, there was a little bit of cordoning that was done, but for a bigger event, some of that cordoning might be a bit more extensive. And so some of the flow-on effects of having your central business district closed include things like, reduced revenue, loss of employment, but we did also see an upturn of certain jobs in sectors like constructions. So it wasn't all 100% bad. There were a lot of quite significant impacts, but some sectors did benefit from those, from being able to rebuild the city. So that's where I'm going to stop now. I'm going to hand it over to Natasha, who's going to talk a bit more about preparedness.
Frozen slightly, bear with me. Oh, there we go. All right, hi everyone. So yeah, my name's Natasha Blunden, and my job is to kind of bring all this wonderful impact information together and think about how emergency services, infrastructure providers, and civil defence might respond to this sort of event in future. So just to summarise a little bit, so the impacts we've heard about tonight, they would be severe for New Zealand, and they would constitute a national scale disaster. It would be catastrophic. And as we've heard, there would be landslides, and you can see in the diagram on the right hand side, this would effectively turn the North Island into a couple islands. So essentially, some parts of the North Island East Coast in this scenario, and it's important to note that this is just one scenario, but in this scenario, some parts of the North Island East Coast may be cut off for some time. And so you could think of them as almost being like our COVID-19 bubbles, where we'd be quite dependent regionally on each other. Some other impacts that we'd see would be some of our communities would become displaced, and that could be from the initial evacuation from the long or strong earthquake. It could be because some of our housing is damaged, and we might not be able to go back to our house immediately. Another reason for displacement as well is, New Zealand quite often has a lot of tourists in the country, and that those people would also need some care in terms of where they would be staying. As this is a big event again, we would have injuries and fatalities, and Julia gave us some examples of what the numbers we saw in the Christchurch earthquakes. And I think it's also important to remember as well that our emergency services, they're members of our community too, so they would be going through a significant event as well in their life, and they'd also have really large demands on them personally as part of their role. Being a big scale event, there'll be massive damages to our economy, our local, our regional and our national economy, and there will be some long-term psychosocial impacts, such as what Julia mentioned before. And we have heard a little bit tonight and last week around how this scenario might affect our lifelines. So those things we rely on to communicate with our friends and family and cook our dinner each night. So because it's just one scenario, I think it's important for us all to think about what we'd do without power, without water, without phone or internet. You might have thought, listening to William, oh, maybe my region's not so severely affected, but it is worth considering this, even if you live somewhere else, because there's a number of hazards that New Zealand is faced with, of course. So preparing for one hazard can help you prepare for others. So in terms of power, it's really useful to have a torch or a camping stove. With water, we recommend 3 litres per person per day, and don't forget about your pets as well with that. And if you know you're in a place that's likely to be isolated, store some more if you can, go for it. In terms of, no wastewater, we may have to use makeshift toilets. And if we can't use our phone or internet, having a radio is really handy as well to be able to have the latest information in an emergency. So that's a lot of information for you. So if you want to check it out after this talk, go to getready.govt.nz, where you can find a whole suite of resources, including how you talk about the impacts of an event like this, figuring out what sort of supplies you might need. So you might have specialist medical needs that you need to account for, or accounting for pet food. And you can also look at how you can make a plan and tailor your plan for your family or your household. So I just wanted to really finish my part on just putting the question out there, what's your plan? Have you thought about what you would do in a large scale emergency? And it doesn't have to be an earthquake or tsunami, it could be any hazard event. As we know, New Zealand is susceptible to a few. So if you haven't already got a plan, I'd really encourage you to go away tonight and have a think about it. I think if we all took 10 minutes just to have a wee think about what our plan is and take some time to be prepared, New Zealand would be a lot more resilient. So I really encourage you to do that. And with that, I will hand you back to Ben for question time.
Awesome. Hey, first of all, thanks very, very much to the 4 speakers. What a brilliant presentation. Really quite awesome to see the the local specifics of how the scenarios will unfold, but also the kind of confronting realization that things get pretty gritty when people are involved. And I'm pretty, it's pretty remarkable that there's people out there kind of thinking about this stuff and making plans and working out how New Zealand can be more resilient. There's a few questions coming in, so I'm going to start just sort of asking you guys quick fire, depending on who they sort of fall on. But yeah, if you have other questions, please keep posting them. So first of all, this question's for Julia. From your experience in Christchurch and Kaikoura, what led to people being better prepared?
Ah, that's an interesting question.
Bouncing back. No, what's
yeah. I mean, I think really one of the key things to being better prepared is having a social network. So we know that the connections you have with your neighbours or your community, and your community could be anything from a hobby group or a rugby club that you're involved with, or a church group. So some of those social connections I think are really, really important in being prepared, because if you can harness those connections or kind of talk to those people or work with those people, then you're better able to kind of get resources following an event. But I think there are also lots of other things that you can do that Natasha outlined as well. So you need to be also prepared to respond immediately to what's happening. So with the shaking, drop cover and hold to avoid injury. If it's long or strong, get gone. So evacuate for a tsunami. So some of those immediate actions are also really important. And then also having sort of some of those basic supplies as well that are going to get you through. So food and water is essential, things like medication, and having an emergency plan. So knowing how you're going to meet up with people and get back to your friends and family. So it's a bit of a range of things, as well as structurally making sure that your homes are safe as well and your workplaces.
Do you have a comment, Julia, on that with Kaikoura and Darfield and Christchurch, the impacts of those sort of earthquakes have been quite localized, and therefore there's been this opportunity for the government to kind of offer quite a lot of really focused support. When we look at a Hikurangi subduction zone earthquake and tsunami, the impacts could be quite a lot more widespread along the East Coast. So my feeling is that we need to be encouraging people to be a lot more self-reliant and self-sufficient, because there's not necessarily going to be really immediate response from the government and from the civil defence and that sort of thing. I mean, they'll be doing their best, but in an event like this, they are going to be at the max capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes back to what Natasha said about thinking about kind of your COVID bubbles. And actually, if you have an event like that, you might be stuck in your own kind of regional or even more local than that type of bubble. So being self-sufficient, I think, is really important. And I think Natasha can probably add to that. So
Yeah, Natasha probably wants to jump in.
Yeah, no, sorry. I just wanted to quickly say as well something I meant to mention in terms of like speaking of being self-reliant. In an event like this, because the Hikurangi subduction zone is so close to our coastline, it's important to remember that you would need to rely on the natural warning signs for evacuation. So it would be important to evacuate inland or up a hill immediately. And I mean, immediately following along with strong earthquakes. So I'm really taking heed of those natural warning signs is really important. And yeah, comes back to that self-resilience and reliance.
You can't really wait for your neighbour to say, get to high ground. You need to be ready to rock and roll.
No, everybody needs to be a leader. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Back to the science of all this, William and Caro, you might have a few insights on this slightly leading question. What city will be worst hit?
Well, as we kind of tried to say, it really depends on the specifics. So it's very hard to describe. In the scenario that we put forward, there were fairly similarly strong impacts all across Wellington and Hawke's Bay and Gisborne, but with differences of exactly what those impacts would be. So it's hard to really say which would be worst hit in that scenario. But when a real earthquake comes, which city will be affected most is going to be very dependent on the details of the earthquake, where the big movement, the big slip is on that fault. So it could be any one of those, well, any one of the big cities along the East Coast. Caro, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just some observation when we were like touring around New Zealand with the scenario. It was great to see that the capital city, which is the one that everyone points out for the next big earthquake. Obviously, we're very well prepared, but it was really great to see there was a strong sense of preparedness in Napier and Gisborne as well, where we went to visit there. And so, yeah, I think it's good to see that even though they're not they don't have the spotlight for earthquake hazard, they are also pretty well prepared.
Yeah, that's great. I think I have a question that slightly links to that former question you've just answered, William. And you suggested that the scenario might be not that dramatic in terms of tsunami sort of around West Shore and those northern parts of Napier and that sort of thing. Is that just part of that scenario? And could we experience something like we witnessed in Japan or Thailand hitting that coastline from a Hikurangi subduction zone earthquake?
Yes, I mean, there's different scenarios that we looked at. We looked at least 10 different variations, and some of them had much more intense impacts in certain places than others. So in the one that we picked, there were fairly intense effects on West Shore and the river mouths, and it left the Napier CBD relatively unaffected. But there are other scenarios where that wasn't the case, and that we had much more inundation, for instance, in the central part of Napier. That's why I think it's important to remember that when we feel that long or strong earthquake, we should evacuate all of our evacuation zones, because they're trying to cover the whole spectrum of the different things that could happen. So don't read too much into the specifics of the scenario that we developed for this exercise, because there's quite a variation of what could occur in terms of tsunami, and make sure you leave from all of the evacuation zones that are on the evacuation maps.
Better be safe than sorry, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Another question. Once the event starts, is there any chance of knowing where the hypocenter is as it unfolds in real time? I guess the geohazard monitoring team at GeoNet might, but I'm not sure if we can sense that. A spidey sense.
Yeah, I think if it's unfolds like in the mighty 8.9 earthquake, then by the time you start locating the hypocenter, the data will become overwhelmed by the shaking all across the country. So yeah, so for like very large earthquakes, it's hard to get the characteristics of the earthquakes very rapidly. We need other ways of estimating the magnitude and the impact of that earthquake.
Cool.
So the answer is no.
No. You can probably all comment on this to some extent. What was the rationale for choosing a magnitude 8.9 earthquake?
So we wanted something that was that was plausible, but at the upper end of the spectrum of what we believe could really happen. So we looked at the geological data for past earthquakes and tsunamis along the East Coast, and we could see events of up to the same kind of size as the scenario that we put forward. So the magnitude will approximately sets the dimensions, how long and how wide the earthquake is, and 8.9 gave us something that was plausible from what we know geologically, but it's close to the upper end. So people have speculated we could get up to about 9. There's a lot of debate about exactly how large a Hikurangi earthquake could go to. But we wanted something that was close to the upper end, but plausible.
So I guess that's a question from me as well. So you had the Tohoku earthquake, which was sort of 9.2. And then you've had various other ones on the Aleutian Trench and that sort of thing, like 9.6, and then the Chilean one, I think it was 9.8. Why are those subduction zones able to produce much larger earthquakes, or producing larger earthquakes than, say, the Hikurangi subduction zone?
Well, a lot depends on the length of the subduction zone. And here it's tricky because the Hikurangi subduction zone sort of runs on into the Kermadec Trench subduction zone. So if we treat those as separate things, then the largest earthquake we could get on the Hikurangi subduction zone is around 9, but we could get something larger on the Kermadec subduction zone. But it's hard to say that those are really independent. We could have earthquakes that cross over between the two. So yeah, that's one factor that limits the size. The truth is, it's very hard to know exactly what the maximums are. What we could say is that from the geological data, we're seeing things of up to the length of this sort of 8.99 magnitude. We would like to have a bit more data on past tsunamis and earthquakes up in the sort of northern part of the East Cape to be sure that the ones we're seeing don't extend further than where our data is. But based on what we have at the moment, this seems plausible to be the upper end of the range. Caroline, would you like to add anything?
Just an addition from the opposite side of the earthquake spectra, which is we're looking at here subduction zone earthquake, which are capable of generating large earthquakes because they have very large fault zone area. The other type of earthquakes come from crustal type earthquakes, which are linked to faults in crustal part of the tectonic plates. And so they are limited by the depth of the fault, which is usually 20, 30 kilometers deep. So it in itself, it reduces the possibility of rupturing very large surface area. Saying that though, in New Zealand, again, we have some very interesting crustal faults, like the Alpine fault, which is, although it's not very deep, around 15 kilometers wide, it's actually, depending on who you talk to, between 300 to 600 kilometers long. So smaller faults, but very long and also capable of generating, but maximum 8.2 earthquakes. We're not talking about subduction earthquakes. You're not going to have a 99 on the Alpine fault.
Still a pretty scary event though, when it happens. Natasha, you might have something to add.
Yeah, so further context as well. I guess when we kicked off the Hikurangi Response Planning project about 2 years ago, we knew we wanted to plan for a large Hikurangi earthquake and tsunami. So just to decide what a credible scenario would be, we held a hazard workshop with top experts from around the country. And the result of that workshop was that they decided that magnitude 8.9 would be a credible scenario for us to use as a basis for planning. So we've used that scenario as a planning tool to inform the way that we plan and to identify the likely impacts and the consequences.
We've had a little awesome.
I think I'll just briefly add that we can't really be absolutely sure that we can't get earthquakes bigger than a 9, because we could have ones that extend through into the Kimberley Trench. It's just that we don't have, well, we don't have evidence for that at the moment.
Good to keep a limit on that. Well, in a more kind of localized sort of question, would a tsunami cut off Miramar from Wellington?
We could certainly have a tsunami that completely overtops the area between Lyell Bay and Evans Bay, so that everywhere between Miramar and the main part of Wellington would be damaged by a tsunami. So at least temporarily, Miramar could be cut off. There's a different question whether we could have so much subsidence that you know, that's a longer term cutoff. You would have to have a lot of subsidence, and I'm not sure if that's plausible. But at least temporarily, Miramar would be hard to access to and from Wellington.
Not sure who it said, but what goes up can come down, or does come down. Is that necessarily the rule of thumb? I'm not sure.
Well, it's complicated.
Yeah.
The tsunami in 1855 from the Wairarapa fault, that did flood across that area between the two bays. So Miramar was cut off at that time. We think that if you go back about 500 or 600 years, there was a Maori canoe passageway between Lyell Bay and Evans Bay, and that a previous subduction earthquake in that area raised the land, and that became no longer possible to, no longer a navigable channel through there. So that part of land has been pulled, has been moved around by big earthquakes in the past.
Mm. Okay, final question, and I guess this is related to what Julia's doing, in terms of you've been in this space for a long time, and I think working in Napier, we've seen quite a lot of you know, really innovative community initiatives up with the hill suburbs in terms of evacuation research and various other local community things. How do you think people in local communities can get involved? What would you recommend, Julia?
I think that communities can get involved in all sorts of ways, and I think we probably also have to take into account that some people have more time than others. So there are some people who can get fully involved in response planning, maybe joining local emergency management group, getting really involved in some of those activities. We've also got schools where we can talk to kids about how to respond to some of these things and how to prepare for them. There might be people who can only do a little bit. There might be more vulnerable people who might need support from their neighbours. So making sure you know your neighbours and giving them support if they need it. So there are lots of different ways, I think, and different levels in which communities can get involved to support each other to respond to such an event. I also just wanted to say one thing as well. I mean, we're talking about quite a big scenario here, a big event here, and there can be a tendency for us to kind of think, oh my goodness, this is just way too big. I can't think about it. I'm just going to switch off. But for example, we know in Japan, where they did a lot of exercising and a lot of tsunami evacuations, for the Tohoku tsunami, there was about a 95% rate of people evacuating and getting out of the way of the tsunami. So we know that if we do practice some of these things and we do prepare, we can have a good outcome. So those things are all really important to remember.
Yeah, I guess it takes leaders as well in terms of getting our kids involved. I always remember some of the stuff we did at Scouts was about how to be resilient as young people in terms of always having emergency kits and that sort of thing. So there's ways of encouraging it, isn't there?
Absolutely.
So I guess that's all we have time for this evening, 3 minutes past 8. But yeah, that's been very great questions coming in from the audience and some great discussion. And I think it sets a really excellent platform for our final talk next week, which will be 7 p.m. on Wednesday. And unfortunately, this is the last time we're going to hear from Caroline and William. They've brought us the science, but Julia will join us again next week with her colleague, Professor David Johnston, and they're going to focus on understanding their sort of reflection on COVID, what's happened in this sort of resilience space, and whether we're prepared for an event like we've been talking around the scenarios. So I think this will be a really great conversation to be part of. The more the merrier, so please encourage your friends and family to tune in. And if they don't have time, we're going to be posting everything on YouTube. So definitely look at it at a later date, have a family viewing, always great for a movie night on a Friday night, maybe a little bit, not, but yeah, so thanks for coming along. Stay safe out there. Haere rā.